back to This Week in Immigration. I'm your host, Hannah Tyler. In this episode, we're sharing highlights from our June 13th webinar that discussed our most recent report, Immigrant Entrepreneurship, Economic Potential and Obstacles to Success. The report and accompanying webinar examine who immigrant entrepreneurs are, what types of businesses they start, and what obstacles they face. The panelists included Cris Ramón, Global and U.S. Immigration Policy Researcher and Analyst, Christina da Silva, Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs Officer at the City of Dallas, Dane Stangler, Director of Strategic Initiatives at BPC, and Adrian Bota, co-founder and CEO of Origin Milk and an immigrant entrepreneur. The event was moderated by Theresa Cardinal Brown, Managing Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at BPC. Panelists explained the findings of the report, broke down the role of the national government and local municipalities in encouraging immigrant entrepreneurship, and discussed the barriers immigrant entrepreneurs face. A great episode to come, so stick around. To get us oriented to the discussion, here's a clip from Cris Ramón, one of the report authors, providing an overview of the report, the research methods used to compile it, and the key findings and policy recommendations.
So our report was really our effort to really get a sense of who immigrant entrepreneurs are, why they become immigrant entrepreneurs, the obstacles that they face, the way policymakers have responded to these obstacles, and then policy recommendations. Our research was a combination of looking at studies on immigrant entrepreneurs, but also doing interviews with individuals, policymakers, researchers, and nonprofits that work with immigrant entrepreneurs to get a little bit more granular detail on what it is that these individuals experience. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about why they become immigrant entrepreneurs down in this conversation, but just sort of three core areas of findings. One is that immigrant entrepreneurs, start businesses at higher rates than other individuals. The Kauffman Foundation this past March just released a report that found that immigrant entrepreneurs are about 580 individuals for every 100,000 adults. Native-born Americans are about 320 individuals who are entrepreneurs for every 100,000 adults. And we have an entire page of these stats in the report. But I think that gives you a sense of the fact that these are individuals who are starting businesses at higher rates. And they're starting businesses across a whole host of industries. When we were doing the interviews, we heard some interesting stories about the Syrian immigrant in the St. Louis area who started a soap factory. We heard about an immigrant from Europe who started her own solar panel manufacturing business in Massachusetts. And that kind of gives you a sense of the way that these businesses can span a whole host of industries. When we talk about what the obstacles are for immigrant entrepreneurs, there are two core findings that we found. One is that our immigration system doesn't have a proper immigrant entrepreneur visa, and neither does it have a status for individuals who are already here, probably on an H-1B visa, for instance, or a student visa, to adjust status. We do have the EB-5 investor program, but that's really designed for individuals who are coming in with a significant amount of funding to be able to put into a business here in the United States. It doesn't necessarily align with the way immigrant entrepreneurs either need venture capital funding for a high-tech startup or individuals who want to start a mainstream business. So it is an important program, but it's not a substitute for immigrant entrepreneurial visas that we need. Another core issue that these individuals struggle with is sometimes accessing, capital to be able to start their businesses. A lot of entrepreneurs, and Dane, obviously, I appreciate his feedback on this report, is that a lot of folks do come in with their own funding, but if you need funding down the road, if you don't have a credit history because you're a newcomer, if you don't know how to navigate the system because you're a newcomer, those can be problematic barriers to be able to access those resources. And in terms of the responses and recommendations, we have seen both Democrats and Republicans propose legislation to create an immigrant entrepreneurial visa and obviously an immigrant entrepreneurial status to adjust to here in the United States. Unfortunately, we have not seen Congress pass any of this legislation. So one of the first recommendations is that Congress absolutely needs to pass legislation to create these pathways. Another thing is that we spoke with what municipalities are doing with immigrant entrepreneurs. And I think the key thing here is they're doing a lot of great work, ranging from technical assistance to providing funding. But in terms of recommendations, ending duplicative services and having services targeted at the specific needs of immigrant entrepreneurs and other minority groups, offering services in key languages, including recognizing languages can change in a metropolitan area or rural area or exurb, suburban, that can shift. And finally, just ensuring that you're actually doing good faith outreach to immigrant entrepreneur and marginalized communities with trusted navigators. So those are sort of the key findings. I think one last thing is that we don't have great data on immigrant entrepreneurs, so we need to beef up those resources to really understand the economic impact of these folks and the ways that policies can better assist them in starting their own businesses.
As Cris mentions in his overview, the number of entrepreneurs who are immigrants far surpasses those who are native-born Americans. Next, we'll hear from Adrian Bota and Cris as to why this is, followed by comments from Dane Stangler, who provides some additional thoughts on the characteristics of immigrant entrepreneurs.
The immigrant tribe that has been alluded to already is one where people are looking for the opportunity to do something that perhaps there isn't room for or infrastructure for or ability to do in many other countries. And the US certainly has been a country that's laid the foundations for generations that enable entrepreneurs to do what they do, to innovate, to address issues that are unmet in the market, to look at turning things in a different way, engineering, reverse engineering, or again, innovating in a way that is additive and value added to others and to the community and the economy as a whole. And so the reason immigrants have this, I believe, have this drive is because of a lack of opportunity for that ambition to be explored and or implemented in many other countries where entrepreneurship isn't valued, frankly, as much as it is here. And it does have something to do with that individualistic, the individualism that we seek. And that has, that's kind of a double-edged sword. That's a beautiful thing when you want to put your ambitions to work, to innovate in a space where there's an unmet need. And it's more difficult to navigate perhaps when you've got to consider the community as a whole. But I think that entrepreneurs are seeking the opportunities that are wide open here in the US. And those, again, lay the groundwork, the foundation, and the infrastructure to allow things to happen, such as education. And that education opens up one's mind to possibilities or opportunities or ways that we can address issues in creative ways where perhaps others haven't thought of it, but also things such as access to capital markets, which in so many other countries, there isn't an infrastructure to enable this. So whether it's venture capital or angel investors or private equity, or even government grants and funding. And so I think what immigrants are absolutely looking for is the opportunity or the possibility to dream, and then to see that dream come to fruition, to not have people holding them back.
One, immigration is an entrepreneurial act. It's incredibly risky. Look, if you're thinking to yourself, I'm going to go from San Francisco to New York, and that's already a risk. Imagine you going from another country to one where you may not even have ties. That already puts you in a position where you're already open to risk. It's funny because my dad is an immigrant from El Salvador, and he always had one saying, which is "Abre la boca en este país," which literally means open the mouth, but it's literally to hustle and to take advantage of the opportunities that exist here, irrespective of the risks you may face. So that's point number one.
Theresa, to your point, I think I would point to 2 or 3 things that we see in the research and we see in the stories that Cris and Adrian have pointed to for why we see such a disproportionate presence of immigrants in not just entrepreneurship, but also, as you point out, successful entrepreneurship. One, which Cris mentioned, would be education. As Cris pointed out, we see immigrant businesses across all sectors and industries: tech, non-tech, services, manufacturing, everything in between. But because, as you have both pointed out, we do not have dedicated pathways for immigrant entrepreneurs, many of those who we do, have the benefit of having in the U.S., come here through a university degree, or and they come here to study, or they grow up here. And so we know, Theresa, as your team has pointed out, that we have a very large share of the foreign-born, in our science and technology and engineering programs, and we know many of them want to stay here. They are not currently able to join companies, but many of them end up staying here and they start companies. And so we see a really high presence of highly educated immigrants, especially in those science and technology fields. That's why we see immigrants found such a high percentage of quote unquote unicorns, these highly valued, privately held tech startups and other venture-backed and equity-backed companies. Another reason that Cris and Adrian both alluded to is a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs or potential entrepreneurs have very wide and deep social networks to draw on because we have family-based education system. Many, not all, but many new immigrants have family members here, or they're coming into communities, well-established immigrant communities. And we know social networks are a key resource, not just for helping entrepreneurs, but for encouraging entrepreneurs to start in the first place. We know from a lot of research that the more entrepreneurs you know, and the more exposed you are to entrepreneurship as an option for you, the higher your propensity is to start a business. And so it kind of feeds on itself in any community, but that's especially what we see among immigrant entrepreneurs in the US, because they have such wide social networks. And that's a key input for entrepreneurs. And the last thing I would point to, and I know there was some research done on this a few years ago, is, again, because we don't have dedicated entrepreneurial pathways for immigrants to the US, and because we have tended to have more of a family-based system, many, again, not all, but many new immigrants come to the US and have the benefit of multi-generational households. And we know that is a key support net for entrepreneurs. We know from other research that government safety nets, whether it's unemployment insurance or other benefits, can increase the likelihood of people starting businesses. We've seen that, for example, in France and other countries. And in the US, what we see in immigrant communities is that often that multi-generational household really serves as that safety net in the absence of some government program. So if you need childcare, you need help with someone who's sick in your household, you often have that resource to draw on. I think we see that borne out in some of the immigrant entrepreneurship experiences.
National legislation to create entrepreneurial visas is one of the report's key recommendations. In this clip, we'll hear from Dane about the important role immigrant entrepreneurship plays in the U.S. economy.
At a high level, when it comes to entrepreneurship in general in the United States, so the creation and growth, and sometimes shrinkage and exit of new businesses, those young firms, firms that are 1, 2, 5, up to 10 years old, account for really the majority, well beyond the majority of net new jobs that are created every year in the US economy. So we all know, millions of jobs are created every year, millions of jobs are, economists say destroyed, but that's a terrible way to describe it. But, millions of jobs are, go away, right? They're not filled, they're obsolete. What's left over between that gross job creation and gross job destruction is that net addition to the US economy every year. And entrepreneurs are responsible for the lion's share of that net new job creation. Now, over the last 15 years, especially pre-COVID, the new business creation rate in the United States at an aggregate level had been pretty much flat. It really plummeted during the global financial crisis and Great Recession, and it never really recovered. It actually did recover during COVID, but for some reasons having to do with the pandemic. And as Cris mentioned, immigrants have a much higher entrepreneurial propensity than native-born Americans. So even as the overall rate of entrepreneurship in the US was flat for those 12, 15 years pre-COVID, the rate of new entrepreneurial activity that Cris mentioned, that the Kauffman Foundation publishes, was rising, was very high and was rising. In some years, it was about double the native-born American rate. So at a high level, entrepreneurship is key for our economy, for job creation, for innovation, for vibrancy of local economies. And immigrant entrepreneurs over the last 10 to 15 years have been the force that's kept our business creation rate really from falling any further. And they've been, have a disproportionate responsibility for the job creation, the innovation that we've seen. So they're important not just for overall entrepreneurship, but for that local economic impact of really propping up that job creation process at the macro level.
Despite the importance of immigrant entrepreneurs to our national economy, there is no entrepreneurship visa or clear immigration pathway for immigrant entrepreneurs, which leaves a hole in the immigration system. In the next clip, Cris explains how that compares with our neighbor, Canada, and how they encourage immigrant entrepreneurs.
The US immigration system doesn't really have a mission statement, doesn't really have a purpose. It's kind of just a mass of policies. And oftentimes these policies are not particularly good at trying to attract talent or trying to retain talent, especially when you look at, say a country like Canada that has been very deliberate, intentional about attracting talent and retaining talent. One of those channels being its own immigrant entrepreneur visa. And I think that that's sort of the conversation where things need to go, is that what is the purpose of the US immigration system? How does economic-based immigration benefit the United States, and what are different ways that we can facilitate that? And I think that kind of conversation can point to attracting talent, folks who want to work here. They may not be entrepreneurs, but they want to work here, or keeping those individuals, whether they're students or maybe they're on an H-1B, but also attracting and retaining individuals whose potential business ideas can be an incredible catalyst for economic change. So I think that that's where the conversation needs to go, which is, what is the purpose of the US immigration system? And then as a part of that conversation, moving it forward. Unfortunately, of course, immigration reform continues to be mired in politics, and Theresa, you and I have had long conversations about that. So that's, I think, the issue is that we need to have the conversation, but then we also need legislation to actually make this reality. And we're just not seeing Congress step up in the ways that they need to. Over the last, at least since 2013, when the last comprehensive immigration reform effort passed in the Senate, but didn't go into the House and was never signed.
While Congress has not acted so far to create an immigrant entrepreneur visa, local municipalities have stepped up to help immigrant entrepreneurs thrive in their communities. In the following clip, we hear from Christina on the history behind the Welcoming Dallas initiative.
It's exciting to share our journey that we've gone through as a community to recognize not only that immigrants play a big part of our community, they play a big role in our economic development. So about 5 years ago, we recognized immigrants were actually about 24% of our Dallas resident population. And so as a local government, we wanted to partner with local community groups and leaders to support welcoming and integration of immigrant residents that were choosing Dallas as their home. So as part of that process, we actually developed the Welcoming Dallas strategic plan that included recommendations and goals that were collaboratively written with our community partners, and then ultimately shared with our city council. The city council actually adopted this Welcoming Dallas strategic plan as a city resolution. So it's actually part of our local policy to be a welcoming city. And within that Welcoming Dallas strategic plan that was adopted, we actually have 5 pillars. One is leadership and communications, which includes ways that our city, our local government, is going to be using their platform to increase awareness about the role that immigrants play in our community. Safe and healthy and connected communities, working with law enforcement and also health institutions to support access to health and safety resources. Equitable access, as mentioned earlier about language access, this is a big part of that, but also looking at what are some of the other systemic barriers that we could be addressing as a local government to increase access to opportunities. Civic engagement is also another big area. We are actually hosting a naturalization ceremony tomorrow at City Hall. And so that's one of our ways that we uplift civic engagement and also naturalization for our Dallas residents. And then finally, we have our pillar of education and economic development, where we identified as a local government ways that we want to support workforce opportunities for immigrant and refugee residents, and then also how we can increase access to opportunities for immigrant entrepreneurs. All of these efforts, of course, are done in close partnership with our local nonprofit agencies, business institutions, about 100 different members that are actually on our welcoming task force that advise our work. And in fact, our efforts have actually been nationally recognized. Dallas is actually the first welcoming city that is certified by Welcoming America.
Dallas's response to immigrant entrepreneurship celebrates the city's diversity while also seeking to address the barriers that immigrant entrepreneurs face. Here, Christina explains some of the initiatives Dallas has employed and provides ideas that other cities could replicate.
We have been working first to use our platforms to just increase awareness of how immigrants really help advance our local economy and help us become a more globally competitive city. So for example, early on in our efforts, we worked with the local Dallas Federal Reserve Bank and also other economic institutions to publish a data report naming that not only are immigrants part of our growth as a city, but also they're 30% of our workforce, they're 30% of our immigrant or entrepreneur base. So just naming those numbers, sharing stories, I think has been really key to help bringing to light that immigrants are part of our city and how we look towards as how we build our progress. And then also, I think the whole idea of how the city, the local municipality can serve as a one-stop shop point. Actually, here in Dallas in December, we opened what we call our Dallas Small Business Center. And this is specifically supposed to serve as a one-stop shop where anyone who wants to start their business, or maybe they've already started their business, whatever phase they are in their business development, they can actually stop with the Small Business Center and get access to information, resources, tutorials. There's also really an emphasis on looking at how immigrant entrepreneurs, minority entrepreneurs can get access to procurement opportunities. We have a big emphasis on making sure that we have equity in our procurement processes. So that's definitely a big part, because we want to make sure that not only are we investing from the city perspective, our taxpayer money in our city, but we also want to be making sure that we're increasing that access point to entrepreneurs, especially minority groups. This Small Business Center is actually strategically placed within our library, because we know that libraries are one of the few institutions that have sort of that direct contact and have already some established trust with our Dallas residents. Also wanted to echo the idea of community outreach and building trust with community groups. So our Small Business Center has really close relationships with minority contracting organizations and associations, professional groups, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Asian American Chamber of Commerce, African Chamber of Commerce, because we know that without these partnerships, it's really hard for us to make sure that the right people get the right information that they need. In addition, we've also created a mentor protege program that's really designed to connect large businesses, like large prime contractor firms, to provide mutual beneficial assistance to small businesses, including minority-owned businesses and women-owned small businesses. So the goal is to kind of have that one-on-one relationship with large businesses to help those smaller businesses walk through the sometimes complicated process that it takes to become a vendor for the city. Additionally, we've also piloted community navigator programs. These have been mostly under our efforts to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, but we've seen such great success with this type of outreach that our city councilors are actually looking at how we can institutionalize this method. We recently had an RFP go out to have community organizations actually apply and really see how we can really institutionalize the community navigator system of outreach. Because yes, it's so important that when it comes to building trust, that we actually use and work with trusted messengers, because there is a lot of nuance, especially when it comes to providing services for immigrant residents and making sure that they know what they're eligible for and how to walk through that process of accessing it.
One of the biggest barriers that immigrant entrepreneurs face is accessing funding for their enterprises. We'll hear from Adrian and Christina as they discuss how other entrepreneurs in cities can help immigrant entrepreneurs secure the funding that they need.
There are a few funds, there are a few venture capital funds that are focused on immigrants, and names don't come to mind right now, but capital allocation is absolutely a very important one. Tapping into capital is something that many immigrants, I think, fear or feel like they don't have access to, or they don't know how to work that system. Clearly, it's a lot about networking. And so it's getting to know and build those networks. If you went to Stanford and you worked at Google, you're probably going to be able to raise a good amount of money for your tech startup, right? But if you've come in from Central America somewhere, or Eastern Europe, or another part of the world, and you don't have those networks, it's much more difficult to gain the credibility or to have a chance to have a foot in the door with a VC, to put a pitch deck together, to build it, etc. And so I think that many things that we can do, or folks can do here in the US, to help encourage or help make it happen, is really to be a person who comes alongside to carry that burden. And so if you see, or know an immigrant that has an idea, first and foremost, help them disconnect from the safety net, which all of us need to do, which is like, hey, you need to let go of that job, or you need to build this while you're moonlighting, and then let go of that. So some advice and some help and some support along the way, but then simply opening doors, making phone calls on someone's behalf to help them to create a protocol, a prototype rather, to create a prototype, or to get a product out there, or somebody who knows somebody, and through your LinkedIn, they're a buyer at Target, and you can help set up a meeting for this person to go in and pitch. It's things like that we would take for granted here in the US, that come very easily to us, that perhaps others from other countries don't have that confidence, or don't have the connections. And truly, if you have an idea, if you have a really good idea that's worthwhile and is worth commercializing, then oftentimes it does come down to the network. And do you know someone that can help you get that first account, sell that first store, or that first whatever it is, and things can continue to happen from there. So I would think that we just need to be cognizant, purposeful about what we're doing, intentional about helping others and helping others to start a business, and thinking above and beyond ourselves to how we can lend a helping hand, pick up the phone and make a phone call on someone's behalf.
Well, in my experiences in talking with immigrant entrepreneurs and understanding what some of the challenges they experience is really just most of my experience has been with immigrant entrepreneurs who, I guess, like according to the report, would be Main Street companies, right? Some of those small business owners that really contribute to the vibrancy of our neighborhoods. And so, most of my experience has been really kind of shockingly seeing how a lot of times these are vulnerable entrepreneurs. Sometimes they're put in very vulnerable situations, especially when it comes to funding or, getting into risky loans. And so, I think for me, one of the biggest things has been, trying to advocate for more increased financial literacy, increased, the venture capital opportunities. So, that's one thing that we're trying to identify with our small business center, is seeing how we can make sure there's just more clear information about what funding opportunities are available, what institutional supports are available. I think also from my experience too is how important some of those relationships are when it comes to making sure folks get that information. I get probably an email once a week from someone who is either starting their business or they've already started their business because somebody heard that we have an office that supports immigrants. And so I think sort of like that name or that reputation helps immigrants feel safe in asking their questions that sometimes they might be afraid to ask. So, one of the things that I've been trying to work on with our entrepreneur supports is how can we brand these services and this information to be very explicit. I think in the report, it does talk about some language that we could be using to sort of, help people know what's available to them. For example, including language about ITIN numbers and, having information obviously in different languages. So I think we have a lot of work to do in that regard. And I think though I'm really happy to see that we're having these kinds of conversations because This is definitely a topic that I know a lot of immigrant entrepreneurs have a lot of questions about. A lot of leaders may not be aware about the issues that a growing number of their entrepreneurs face. So I think this is definitely the first step to addressing those challenges.
Our final clip from the webinar comes from Adrian, where he talks about the possibilities that immigrant entrepreneurship could bring to the United States.
It's sad to know or to think that whatever administration has come and gone, we see that the opportunities are not where they should be. There's so many more people that could be coming and adding and being value add from various countries that are literally dying to get here, that have ideas that we can't even fathom today. That we're so lucky to be able to have folks like that wanting to come here as opposed to anywhere else, and they can build that foundation and take it who knows where here in the US.
And that's it for our show this week. Many thanks to Naledi Askew of BPC's events team for help with the webinar, and to our guests, Cris Ramón, Dane Stangler, Christina da Silva, and Adrian Bota, and Theresa Cardinal Brown for moderating. Thank you for listening. If you would like to read the full report or watch the full webinar, visit bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. One last reminder to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform, and share it with your friends and colleagues. I'm Hannah Tyler. This Week in Immigration was created and executive produced by Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Colleen Putzel, Hannah Tyler, and Theresa Cardinal Brown. Ethan Plotkin produces and edits our show. The executive producer of BPC Podcast is Lucy Manning. See you in 2 weeks.